it unfortunately puts us in this position where the wider public can look at women and say, I'm owed an explanation. If she doesn't give me her explanation that she had cancer or that she is on a medication or that she has recurrent loss, if I don't know the reason, therefore she's doing this for vanity, which could not be more wrong. If you were looking for an easy route, you would choose something different than surrogacy because surrogacy is not easy. I would love to meet a mom by IVF and surrogacy who said, that was the simplest thing that I've ever done in my life because I wouldn't be able to relate and they would stick out like a unicorn to me. There are so many invisible reasons a person can approach surrogacy and they're all valid.
Welcome to my fertility podcast, Superhumans, the show that brings you expert insights, personal stories, and the latest in fertility care all in one place.
Whether you're starting your fertility journey, navigating challenges, or just exploring your options, we're here to empower you with knowledge, support, and hope.
Join us as we dive deep into topics that matter most, from IVF and fertility treatments to mental health and wellness.
I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise. We're two of the fertility specialists at Markham Fertility Centre in Markham, Ontario, Canada. Think of us as your sisters in all things fertility. Let's demystify the world of fertility together. Today, we welcome Baden and Zane to my fertility podcast. Baden is the founder of Not My Tummy, which turns the traditional model of finding a surrogate on its head using the power of public relations, marketing, and digital media. Her partner, Zane, lives and breathes political outreach and fertility advocacy. Having spent years working at Queen's Park, he now works in government relations, consulting for one of Canada's premier boutique firms. Zane is also the proud board chair of Conceivable Dreams, Ontario's fertility patient advocacy organization. Together, Baden and Zane take us through building their family through surrogacy. They are currently on their second journey and are actively looking for a gestational surrogate. You can follow Baden on Instagram at NotMyTummy. Baden and Zane, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for being here today. Let's start with you, Baden. Tell us about what led you to sitting here with us on my fertility podcast on a Tuesday afternoon. Tell us about your fertility journey.
Thank you for having me on. My journey started really, really young. It started when I was 14 months old when I was diagnosed with epilepsy. That diagnosis was what really changed the course of my life, especially my fertility journey. As someone with epilepsy, I've had to cycle through a number of medications in order to control my seizures and finally landed on one medication that worked, that keeps me nice and healthy and safe, but is unfortunately not a pregnancy safe drug. I was on that for a long, long time. And it was on that drug that I met Zane. We met when I was 18 and he was 20. And on our very first date, I put it all out there. I said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to carry my own baby. And thankfully, that did not scare him off on the first date. Fast forward a number of years, I did try to switch onto a different medication that was safe for pregnancy. Unfortunately, I was not successful in that switch. I began having seizures. I had to give up my license for a little while because I wasn't well. And as a family, we decided that that was not going to work for us, that my health had to come first, and that the option that was going to be best for us in moving forward and growing our family would be surrogacy.
You say it now, sort of looking back on it, and it sounds like a straight line. I had a diagnosis, I tried it, but it must have been a lot more difficult than that. Like, did you have some back and forth? Did you have some hesitations? And this seems like a big step from going like, I'm going to put my health first and I'm going to do this other thing. I imagine that at the time it wasn't that simple.
No, definitely not simple at the outset. You grow up as a young woman expecting your fertility journey to look a certain way. And certainly you hear people say, oh, when you're pregnant, you'll experience X, Y, or Z. Or you look at yourself in the mirror and you think, one day I'm going to have a cute little baby bump, and that will be my experience on my road to motherhood. And there was certainly that question mark for many years about whether or not I would be able to switch to a medication that would allow me to be pregnant. And it was difficult because I always had to maintain that hope while also being realistic with myself. And it wasn't until I was, I want to say around 25, Zane can correct me if I'm off by a year or two, that we really knew that that would be the path.
And I'll add one more point is that when we first started getting to know each other, and even Baden, to speak throughout your teenage and adolescent experience, you never met with a fertility doctor. You never really understood, was this an egg quality issue? Was this a uterine issue? Like, you couldn't have kids. We didn't know what that meant. It was as if getting diagnosed as barren from biblical times, because a teenager isn't going to see a fertility specialist. It's only based on the knowledge of the family physician, and they only have a limited amount of information that they can share. Even the neurologist isn't an expert in fertility. So it took decades of knowing not whether or not you'd be able to carry kids, but whether or not you'd be able to have kids before we actually have a meeting to say, no, your eggs are fine, your sperm are fine. The issue lies in neural tube development. The issue lies in only the first trimester and only the first couple of weeks of gestation, which are the most important for brain development and the most important for growing an embryo. And if that fails, then it doesn't bode well for the rest of the pregnancy. There was just so much unknown for so many years before we had clear answers.
As well, that, it's a cute little anecdote that I sometimes throw in that I mentioned on our first date that maybe I wouldn't be able to carry. And I always kind of throw that in and haha, Zane didn't mind so much. Clearly I looked good enough on the date. But the reality was there was a reason that I was throwing that out there at 18 years old on a first date with someone. There's a lot of stigma around infertility and specifically around surrogacy. I didn't know what my future would look like. I knew I wanted kids, but I didn't know what my ability would be to make that happen. And I certainly was very nervous and very self-conscious about falling for someone only to be rejected on that basis. And that really can hit to your core as a person, as a woman. So it was something that I threw out there almost as a test, right? If this person's going to walk away, then they weren't worth my time anyways, but it was also a defense mechanism.
Of course, that makes sense.
I'm so curious though, Zane, like when you were there on that first date, you meet this cute girl, you're picking out your outfit, whatever, you sit down to meal, whatever, I don't know what the first day was. And then she says this, like, first of all, you're 20 years old, so that's probably an important part of the context. But what did you think? Like, how did you process that? And did that change over time? Did you ever kind of revisit that and think about that anymore?
It's a good question. Listen, that date lasted 4 or 5 hours. We closed the coffee shop. We talking about everything, and it got very, very heavy. This only one of the parts of that conversation. Or at least that's how I think it was. It could be Mandela syndrome at this point. I like to imagine that's what it was like. And there were so many other pieces, some better, some worse, in this conversation of talking about our lives and growing up and the good and the bad and the ugly, that it spoke so much to Baden's character and her resilience. And I thought, if she can get through what she's been through, this is just a blink of an eye compared to a lot of that stuff. You're right that there is a level of emotional maturity that you're just not thinking about family planning at 20, and you're thinking it's a date, but not the last first date or a date for life. I always went into dating, even when I was younger, with the level of like, I don't want to just find something casual. Like, I don't like getting my heart broken, so why go on a date with someone or go on a second or a third date with someone if you don't think that there's something there? So why waste my time? And so I was very interested in the whole package, and I don't take no for an answer. And I don't mean that about the date. I mean that about, no, you can't have kids. I'm like, there has to be a workaround. Let's find another doctor. I don't buy what you're selling. And maybe I was too dismissive, but we did find a workaround and we did learn more information and we grew together in that knowledge, and it obviously turned out very well.
Let me ask you, because I don't have any hearing out of my right ear. I was born with deafness on my right ear, and I was diagnosed very young. I remember being in school and a kid was trying to tell me something, a secret, and the teacher noticed I could not hear at all, even though I was out in the world, obviously hearing. So the teacher told my parents took me in and they did the measurement and there was nothing there and I only have the left ear. They told my parents, don't expect very much from her. She's got a disability. very minimal expectations, all the things. So when he shared that story in the podcast, it made me think about that experience. And also for you, infertility is a disease, but so is epilepsy. So can you talk a little bit about that? Being told those things and defying the odds and like saying, taking no for an answer and saying, screw you doctors, you don't know.
Yeah, I'm very lucky that I've always had a ton of family support. So even when I was young and unable to advocate for myself at that point, I had family around me who, if they didn't like the answer that was being given, it was, where do we find a second opinion? How do we better give her opportunity to thrive, whatever that means for her? And there wasn't a level of expectation from my family on what I would accomplish, but there was the idea that I should be the one to define that, not my diagnosis. So that was pretty important to really growing up and understanding myself and my epilepsy diagnosis. I think the hardest was when I was 13. The doctor said, and I would say to my face, but they were talking to my parents, not to me. They said, she'll never get married. She'll probably never finish high school. University is off the table, a family, none of that's going to happen for her. You should be mentally preparing that she's going to essentially be a burden to you. And imagine sitting there, a doctor who's supposed to be, giving you the best shot possible, talking through you, not seeing the humanity in you, and being a child and just being told that you'll never have any of these things that you dreamed of. I took that though, and in that moment made a mental checklist of all the things that they said I would never do. The final two being have a child and to go scuba diving, which somehow ended up on my list. But I finished high school, went to university with a scholarship, got a master's degree in health communication, met my person, was upfront about my diagnosis from day one, didn't scare him off. I'm pretty proud of myself, to be honest, in not letting that stuff define me, to finding my community, to finding other people with epilepsy who had heard similar things from their doctors and are high achievers who've accomplished so much in their lives, and knowing that we can and will and should always try to defy the odds. But I think that speaks to the responsibility of doctors to see their patients as more than a series of symptoms or, a line in a medical textbook, but to really look to those patients and say, how do I help them as a person?
Absolutely. When I talk to patients about low ovarian reserve and all the things that go into a prognosis for fertility, I always tell them a diagnosis is not a prognosis. A diagnosis is a label that describes the thing, but what happens to you and what happens to your ovaries, what happens to your follicles in this case, or what happens with the rest of the life, that's something completely different. It is something that we learn in medical school and also through experience as well. And many doctors are very good at it, but unfortunately, there are some doctors that still kind of forget that you're treating a person, not a disease.
Absolutely, for sure. And I mean, we work in the field of fertility and that's kind of our comfort zone, but it's true. I can remember so distinctly this one time I had a patient, young, she was in her early 30s, and I got back her AMH, so her ovarian reserve testing. Her AMH was really low, like super, super low. And I was going to be seeing her that day. And in my brain, I was preparing how I'm going to essentially break bad news, right? To be like, you talked about wanting multiple children and all this, but this is kind of the reality situation. And so I get on the call with her and she's like, I had a positive home pregnancy test. I was like, great. And I tell that story to patients not infrequently for those people who have that low egg reserve. It's just, absolutely, yes, she's got the diagnosis, decreased ovarian reserve, but it's not the prognosis, right? And those kinds of stories, I think, of patients are really, really powerful for people to have that and to know that. I'm sure that there's lots of people who are listening to this podcast with epilepsy, with other chronic medical conditions who were told X, Y, and Z. And I think it's a very inspiring thing for sure.
I'll add one more piece. When Baden and I were first getting to know each other, she was telling me that her epilepsy was unique in that when she was having absence seizures, and this is kind of getting to the neurology a little bit of it, having absence seizures, typically you're kind of staring off into space for 20, 30 seconds, and you're not gaining the information that is being spoken to you. That's why people will often do so poorly in school, but why it wasn't being caught. And Baden's cases was she could actually talk through it and maintain eye contact, maintain a conversation, maintain a clear and articulate thought while not registering anything on the inside. So I already thought she was a medical marvel. And so everything else is secondary to that. It's a unique case, and it's unique in the neurology space as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll add, I think I'm in some kind of footnote of a report somewhere out of Cleveland Clinic, because the doctors, they had me hooked up to an EEG, and they had a little button, and they asked my mom, I think I was 14 or 15 at the time, they asked her to push a button every time she saw a seizure so that they would have a corresponding like beep of the button with the paperwork,
brain activity.
Brain activity. And one of the neurologists came into the room very angry with my mom and said, why aren't you pressing the button? She's having all these seizures and you're just sitting there having a chat with her. You know, we'd asked you to do one thing and please do it. And she said, she's not having any seizures. She's fine. And the doctor turned to me and said, are you not recognizing these as seizures? And I looked at them and I said, no, I think I'm fine. I'm just watching a movie. And while I was saying that, they looked at the screen and they said, no, that's a seizure. And they couldn't understand why I was having this coherent sentence come out of my mouth while I was having what looked like an absent seizure. So it was a little bit complicated to catch and control my epilepsy. It's why I cycled through so many medications before landing on the one that works. But yes, I don't know how relevant it is to the rest of the conversation, but it definitely played a role in how difficult it was to diagnose me and to get me the proper treatment.
No, it goes to show the complexity. I mean, I'm always fascinated, obviously my field of fertility, but in all fields of medicine, that it's just so much that we just don't know, right? Let's talk now about surrogacy. Tell us a bit about what that journey was like. How did you decided on which surrogate to work with? How did you find your surrogate? And what that experience was like?
Starting a surrogacy journey was obviously not an easy thing to begin, even though we knew that that was going to be the path. There was so much mental preparation for that. There was thinking about our timeline, getting our finances in order, because as we know, fertility is not inexpensive, but certainly when you layer surrogacy on, you're jumping straight into the deep end of the fertility world. And finding a surrogate and finding the right surrogate is a really complicated process. So initially, when we started our journey, we truly went to Google and searched, how do you do surrogacy in Canada? As many people who turn to surrogacy do. We didn't know the legalities around it. We didn't know how the process went. Do you just search on a message board, surrogate available, or do you ask a friend? These were all questions that really were flying around our brains as we were getting started. So the first thing that we ended up doing was signing with an agency. That agency doesn't exist anymore. They went bankrupt partway through when we were working with them, unfortunately. But even with that agency's support, they were unable to introduce us to any qualified candidates, much less a match. And so Zane and I started thinking about our timeline and what we wanted. And we kind of came to the conclusion that nobody was going to be able to tell our story in as compelling a way as we would. And neither of us are afraid to put ourselves out there, though we were a little bit more apprehensive at the beginning. It seems like so long ago, especially as people who are quite open about our fertility now. But at the time, it was a bit scary. But we ultimately decided one January evening to start up a blog and an Instagram page. And I thought we'll share a little bit about our journey and who we are as people. And maybe our friends will share it with their friends who will share it with their friends. And we'll have a couple people look and maybe we'll find someone. Well, what ultimately happened was something much bigger than that. We posted a few Instagram posts and reels, and on our third or fourth reel, we went internationally viral. We had a reel that reached nearly 700,000 people globally, and we had what I will describe as one of the most unlikely things happen. We had 3 or 4 dozen surrogates reach out, saying that they were interested in getting to know us, potentially matching and carrying a baby for us. And for those of you who are listening, who are looking for a surrogate, who've been looking for a surrogate for a while, I don't have to tell you that that is the craziest thing to hear. It's often hard to find one person, much less 40 people.
Like winning the lottery.
It really was. And well, when we started reaching out to these people to get to know them better, a number of them were in the States, and that wasn't an option for us. We wanted to do a Canadian journey, ideally as close to home as possible. So we started to go through, once we weeded out people who were international, we had still a number of really great conversations going with Canadian women who were looking to become surrogates. We ended up matching through that post. And beyond that, a number of the intended parents that we had befriended through the Instagram world, we were able to make an introduction for them. And from that initial post, I think 4 or 5 babies have been born.
Oh, wow.
And the irony of all ironies is our baby was not born through that post. The match that we initially had actually fell through. Our initial surrogate's son got sick and she had to back out and prioritize her own family, which absolutely was the right call for her. And I would say for anybody considering surrogacy, you have to have your own family stable and taken care of first. But we put ourselves out there a second time on our Instagram, once again went internationally viral. And it was through that reel that our surrogate, Ashley, who carried our daughter for us, found us. And when I say sparks flew immediately, I really do mean it.
That's really beautiful. And my understanding is now you have a business.
Yeah, I like to say it was an accidental career switch because after we matched twice using Instagram and we ended up finding all these leads and connecting other people started reaching out again from around the world saying, you were really good at sharing your own story, creating an account, writing a blog. Could you share your secret sauce with me and give me some guidance? And of course, I wanted to help anyone and everyone. But at the time, I had my full-time job in medical communications and I was busy. So I would do my work downtown and then I would head home. I would be living my life with Zane, preparing for the arrival of our daughter. And I would also be helping people to tell their story and hopefully attract a surrogate. And in doing that, people were very quickly finding this process to be successful. Whatever my secret sauce was, it was working. And I helped a dozen more people match. I realized that there was something there and that I could do something that felt more meaningful than my regular communications work. Thankfully, I have a very supportive partner who was open to me going straight from parental leave into launching my own business, which of course, there's always risk in starting something new. But it has been the joy of my life to be able to bring people closer to their dream of having a baby every single day and working with people from around the world. I feel immensely privileged to be able to do this work.
That's really incredible. And it's something that when you say it, it seems like such a necessary need. In my mind, I was saying like, duh, like, why doesn't anybody else doing that? And I guess those are the best business
I
ideas.
don't want the competition. Don't give away the secret.
No. Fair enough. Those are how the best businesses start, right? Where they're fulfilling a need when somebody truly understands what that need is. Even if it is a niche, every niche is actually way bigger than you think.
Yeah.
But I guess, one of the things that a lot of people sort of wonder when it comes to social media and talking about it and sort of being open about their journeys is, what kind of reactions, what kind of responses you might get and sort of fear and anxiety and apprehension around that. You had 700,000 views on that first viral reel. What were the reactions like from the people close to you, from people who you didn't know, the random strangers on the internet? And how do you navigate that?
I'll break it down into 2 pieces. So from the people in our lives that we knew beforehand, a lot of them who we hadn't talked to about this sent us messages saying, I had no idea, and that's so brave of you, and anything I can do to help. If you want me to share your message, if you just need someone to talk to, I'm there. And I think that is true, not just of surrogacy, but of fertility in general, that sometimes when we are going through it quietly, we don't realize that we have all of these people in our support networks who would love to be there to lean on and to cry with us and to jump for joy when we have success. But when we're quiet and when we don't feel comfortable sharing, as much as it can be helpful to protect our hearts, if you are open to sharing, you gain yourself a community of people around you who are willing to love and uplift you, which is amazing. And then I guess to speak to the number of people, the 700,000 people who saw our posts, I was bracing myself when I noticed it started to go viral. When the first 10,000 people saw it, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm famous. When the first 20,000 people saw it, I thought, this is bananas. When it hit 100,000 and kept going, I thought, oh my goodness, I'm I'm in deep trouble. This is a potentially controversial topic, and I don't know what's going to come of it. To this day, I look back at the comments and I'm pleasantly surprised that almost all of them were supportive. I count myself lucky, but I also think that the surrogacy world online, the fertility world online, is somehow gentler and kinder than I expected it to be. And I know that's not everybody's experience all of the time. I've had my fair share of rude comments, but they are few and far between compared to the number of people who've reached out saying, I was hurting, I was struggling, I was going down the same path as well. And hearing your voice in this has made me feel less alone. Or the people who've said, you know, watching your surrogacy journey inspired me to become a surrogate for someone in my community. And I carried one child, two children, and I changed someone's life. I changed someone's legacy. I think the overwhelming positivity that's come of it has, without a doubt, outweighed the odd person who says something uneducated about surrogacy and IVF and fertility in general.
What advice would you give to people who are thinking about sharing? And also, what do you think are the main, and this could be two different questions, but what do you think are the main advantages of trying to find a surrogate on your own using social media versus trying to be matched with a standard agency?
When we're looking at whether or not to share, I can see that there are some people who cannot be public for whatever reason. Maybe you have a career that doesn't allow you to share anything really about your life publicly. And that's okay. If you're not able to share, don't feel like you will never reach that goal of growing your family. There are other supports available to you that will help you if you need to be more private. Agencies in particular are very supportive in those circumstances and can really help. I don't like to look, though, at going public on social media as you're either with an agency or you're going public. I think if you want to be independent and not use an agency and just rely on social media, you absolutely can. If you want to be with an agency and also layer being public into your search, I think that's a great option. I actually would say that more than half of the people that I work with directly are also with an agency and they just want to hedge their bets. They are looking at it that they can see some of the values that the agency offers them, but they also feel that Zane and I felt that they are their best advocate. They could tell their story better than anyone else, and that they want to put themselves out there and hopefully maximize the number of eyes on their story, maximize the number of potential surrogates who could reach out to them, and hopefully close that timeline. Maybe your agency is going to take you a year or more in order to possibly introduce you to someone. And that's fine if that's something that you can work with. But if you want to maybe make it happen a little faster, the best thing that you can do is take on the reins and put yourself out there and try to close that gap yourself.
Let's talk about, I think you described it as the sparks flew when you finally met or when you first interacted with the surrogate. It's a very interesting turn of phrase because it's often something that we might say when we're meeting a potential romantic partner, right? Like a first date, sparks flew. What were you looking for when you were thinking about a surrogate? You mentioned geography, of course. And what was the thing that made you think, aha, this is my person?
There's a number of things that are important when you're looking for a match. And I'll put them into a couple different buckets. One is medical criteria. Is this somebody that your clinic would approve? Is she in the right age demographic? Is she generally healthy, a non-smoker, non-drug user? Those pieces. And every clinic has a slightly different view on who they would approve. But really, that's a conversation that you have with your doctor and say, what are the parameters that I need to be aware of from a medical standpoint? And always trust your doctor on that. So that's bucket number one. Can they medically qualify to be a surrogate? But I would actually say, as important as all of those factors are, and you can't skip any of them, it's not the only important factors. First of all, your values have to align on things that are quite contentious, like termination and vaccination. Many surrogates hold the view that they wouldn't terminate the pregnancy under any circumstances, including their own health. If that is not something that you are comfortable with, you cannot match with a surrogate who holds that view. If that is something that you are comfortable with and your medical team is also comfortable with, then that could be a match that works for you. But ultimately, those values have to align, and you cannot go into a match saying, what's the likelihood that something happens? Because these things are so important. The last bucket that I think is really, really, really important when you're looking for a match, and something that isn't talked about enough, is those shared interests, hobbies, and just general, do you like them questions. Is this someone you could be friends with? Is this someone you could trust? At the end of the day, you are doing a trust fall to the highest degree with this person that you are, in many cases, just meeting through this surrogacy journey. You are trusting them with your most precious thing in the world, your embryo, your future baby. You have to know that when you are not in the room with them, they're making all of the decisions with how this pregnancy is being gestated. And you have to trust that they have your baby's best interests at heart and your best interests at heart at all times. If you don't trust them, if you don't like them, then you're not likely to go on a nice journey together. You will be on edge the whole time. Your surrogate is going to feel like, why did they ask me to do this huge thing for them and they don't even enjoy spending time with me? It's not fair to you or to a surrogate to match with someone you don't like spending time with. When I talk about sparks flying between our first surrogate, Ashley, and Zane and I, the things that jump out are not necessarily where she lived or the fact that she met the medical criteria, though those things were important. They were the fact that we are both massive dog lovers, that we have good senses of humor, that we both enjoy a good cup of coffee in the morning. You know, we like to go camping and exploring and traveling. The conversation between our families felt easy. And I immediately got the feeling that I could trust her with truly anything. These are the things that make for a good match and that immediately drew me to Ashley and to her family, because let's not discount the fact that her family was involved too. And I want to throw it over to Zane because maybe he can speak to some of the spark on his behalf.
Yeah. The things that really excite me, both about Ashley and her family and about chatting with other surrogates or future surrogates for our second journey, is asking questions about how they parent and what does mealtime look like for them and what are the values that they want to impart on their children. Sometimes that's religious values or political values, or what are things that guide them, or core pillars that guide them. Because, as odd as it sounds, those are the conversations, that's the home life that our embryo is going to be privy to, whether they can register it or not, for 9 months. And that's the kind of warmth or coldness that they're going to be exposed to. And so we wanted it to be something that best replicated our own home life and our own meal time and our own family values. Not because of some sort of, growing by osmosis or anything like that, though it could be kind of cool to think about, but because that's just, that going back to what Ben was saying, that's what you feel most safe with, and that's what you trust the most, is a family not unlike your own. And likewise, if you had Ashley on the podcast here, she would say that she saw her and her husband in us, just 7 years younger. And that we just seemed like the kind of people that were going to bring the kids into the world that they have. And that's what made the connection so special.
That makes a lot of sense. You said at the beginning that there is a lot of stigma around surrogacy. There's a lot of stigma around infertility, but surrogacy in particular. Can you tell us what are some of the misconceptions that you think people have about surrogacy that are not true and that you wish people knew or understood better?
I think maybe we'll lead with some of the strangest questions that we've got. Zane, if you can weigh in on that. This is an interesting one. They asked if we would match with a surrogate of a different ethnic background. And I said, sure, why not? People are people. And they said, oh, so you might have a mixed race baby. I was perplexed. And it took me a moment to register that they didn't realize that it would be my egg. So a lot of people don't realize that primarily when we talk about surrogacy in Canada, we're talking about gestational surrogacy, which is a very different thing than traditional surrogacy. Traditional surrogacy exists where the surrogate is also donating her egg in that circumstance. It is far less common, becoming less and less common as time goes on. I'm speaking anecdotally, but we mostly see it in instances where, a sister is acting as a surrogate for her sibling who maybe doesn't have eggs to offer and where there still is a family connection in that way. But in our case, it was gestational surrogacy. So we did have to debunk that for a lot of people. Not that we heard this one directly from anyone we knew, but I know a lot of people ask, does the male partner have to have intercourse
Oh my
with
God.
the surrogate? I think that comes from lack of education.
Right.
And, this is something that happens in a fertility clinic, and there's no improper relationship going on between parties. And so that's something we've had to educate people on. Zane, what are some of the ones that you've heard?
Well, there was an example of our Baden and I going to have intercourse the night before the transfer, so it feels like we're making the baby all day.
Right.
And I said,
That's creative, actually.
creative.
I
yet-
wouldn't start with that one, but that's creative. I kind of like that.
Yeah. I basically said in far less polite terms that I'm saying now, I'm not telling you my schedule. And Baden and I have moments of intimacy. That's neither here nor there.
I gotta
Yeah.
say though, I'm surprised and not surprised because I can definitely think of instances where I've caught myself making assumptions about what somebody's knowledge is about things that are fertility related, because I think especially when it comes to fertility and egg, sperm, and how they all kind of come together, there is actually very little knowledge, even from people who are extremely well educated, right? Just because you have a PhD in like finance or something, I don't know, does not actually mean that you ever really necessarily learned about eggs and sperm, right? Let's be honest, most of us probably didn't pay so much attention in sex ed if we had sex ed.
Right. I mean, when you're at that age, you're like, I'm hanging on to every word. This is the dirty stuff that you're not supposed to talk about in school, and we're talking about it in school.
I mean, I can think of a patient who was contemplating a surrogate, and she asked me whether she could have intercourse with her partner who had sperm, and then I would just like move the embryo from her uterus into the surrogate's uterus. So she thought that that's how it happened. And at first it's like, I was kind of taken aback by the question, I have to admit. But then I was like, I really need to consider to go back to first principles of where the components are coming from and how the things are coming together with patients at least once to have that conversation. But there's a definite lack of knowledge for sure.
It's interesting that you mentioned that example, because one of the things that I've seen online as someone who watches far too many animal videos, I'm sure many people can relate. I didn't realize this, but this is how they actually do quote unquote surrogacy with racehorses. They get horse pregnant through insemination, essentially like an IUI. They get her to, I think, around 7 days pregnant gestation, and then they flush the embryo out, and then they put the embryo into a less valuable racehorse to become
no idea.
Yeah. And so I think people who are, I don't know, who are interested in horses or animals might see that and say, oh, it must be the same with human surrogacy. So it's not a far leap. I can understand it. We've myth busted just now some of the funnier things that come up. But one of the questions I get a lot, which is less funny, is, were you envious of your surrogate? Did you resent her? Did it make you feel bad to watch her have this cute little baby bump, to be getting together, to do things throughout the journey? My experience was no. I did not feel jealous or envious. That said, I know some people have complicated feelings, especially for those who've had recurrent loss or something to that effect. We were coming to surrogacy having never tried to conceive naturally, but sometimes it can be a complicated feeling. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to approach it, as long as you are honest and having good communication with your surrogate. We were very fortunate that Ashley, our surrogate, was really good at walking this fine line between keeping me really informed on what was going on. Baby is kicking now. I'm feeling this way. I'm feeling fatigued, whatever. I got to know all the symptoms that she was experiencing, but she was careful with her language, essentially to not allow me to feel badly that I wasn't the one going through it. She was always sensitive to my emotions because she's my friend, right? That's what the core of this is. And I think part of when I say you need to find someone who you like and trust, ultimately, if someone is your friend and they are doing this for you, they are going to do their utmost to not hurt your feelings, to not make you feel left out. And that was the case. She cared enough about me to know what was going to make me feel included and what was going to be too much information. And I'm very fortunate for that.
When you are talking to a potential surrogate, did you have conversations about that? Like, I want to attend prenatal appointments, or I'm only going to attend certain prenatal appointments, or I'm going to come to ultrasounds, or I'm not going to come to ultrasounds. Who's coming to the birth? When are you going to appear at the birth? What are the things that you sort of have to consider there? And how do you do that?
Well, I think we are incredibly active participants in everything we do. So it's not surprising that we wanted to be there for anything and everything we were allowed to be. I will say that our journey began at the tail end of COVID, and there were still COVID restrictions in place in our clinic and in the OB office. And there was a bit of working around things. We did get lucky. Our doctor was really good about allowing all of us in the room. And by all of us, I mean our surrogate, her husband, Zane, and myself all at once. And we really treated the journey as a collective team. Zane had to miss one appointment along the way for work, I want to say, and I missed no appointments. And it was really important to us that we were able to do that. I understand it's not possible for everybody, and I don't know what our next journey will look like. We now have a toddler to take care of. There might be some additional constraints on us as busy parents, as well as working parents. So every journey will be different, but we were upfront about our desire to be there for everything within her comfort level. She said she was comfortable with us being in the room for everything, so long as she had the ability to go behind the curtain and change where necessary. And of course, I was never going to, pop my head in and say, nope, I got to watch everything. So there was a couple points where the doctor said, okay, intended parents, step out for a second. We'll get the wand where the wand needs to go, and then we'll call you back in. So that was fine by us. And certainly the plan from the beginning, and thankfully the plan worked out. We were there for the birth, and we were there in the room with her. I caught my daughter. Zane cut the cord. It was the most magical experience I wouldn't trade for the world. And we were very fortunate that she felt very comfortable with that whole process and was not shy about, taking on the word surrogate in every sense of the word. She was our surrogate medically, but she was also my surrogate in the sense that she was doing every part of this for me and with me, and really peeled back the curtain for when she had to medically have the curtain not peeled back. But I missed nothing. And it really, from a mental health perspective, helped me to feel really good about the journey and just to walk out of it saying, I don't feel that my journey was anything less than that of any regular mom.
That's beautiful. Back in the day when I was doing OB, I had the pleasure of it was one of our fertility patients, and I happened to be on call when she came on, and she had a surrogate, and it was one of the most beautiful things. You're right. The surrogate was obviously in the bed delivering this perfect baby, and we got the intended mom was there and the intended dad was there. I got her to remove her top so we can do skin to skin right away with the intended mom. She actually caught the baby, her small, and went right into her chest. That cut the cord. It was beautiful. It's one of those deliveries that I will take with me in my collection of high moments in my career, because she happened to be my patient and I happened to be there when she came. So
amazing.
Speaking of patients and misconceptions, I never forget, I had a patient many years ago who needed to do surrogacy for medical reasons, infertility, but she was also like a stunningly beautiful woman. She was a businesswoman and she dressed really well and she looked like a model. So people always assumed she did surrogacy because she didn't want to ruin her body, just because of the way she looked in the world. It was the assumption of everyone that met her. They see a beautiful woman in front of her, well put together, looks like a supermodel. Well, obviously, this is why you don't want to be pregnant. And that bothered her so much, and I can understand why. Can you maybe comment about that? Being one of the misconceptions that people have, that women choose this. And I'm not saying that, women can choose this for whatever reason it's right for them, but the misconception that surrogacy is something that women do to not rule their bodies.
Well, being a 6-foot model myself.
Absolutely. Of course.
No, all jokes aside, it's interesting. I think there's this myth of the vain intended mother, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to say it started through media and the fact that a lot of celebrities will go the route of surrogacy, and not all of them disclose their medical reason for going through surrogacy. Now, could there be people, celebrities or otherwise, who go through surrogacy for, I suppose, vanity reasons? Is it possible? Sure. But in my entire experience in the surrogacy world, I've never met someone who didn't have a medical reason. And what I will say is that I have met people with a medical reason who did not feel comfortable for whatever reason. And again, that reason is up to them. They didn't want to disclose what their diagnosis was. So they would rather have people think that they just didn't want to be pregnant. And they'd rather take the judgment of people than disclose. And that is their right. But I think it unfortunately puts us in this position where the wider public can look at women and say, I'm owed an explanation. If she doesn't give me her explanation that she had cancer or that she is on a medication or that she has recurrent loss, if I don't know the reason, yeah, they think, and therefore she didn't have a reason, and therefore she's doing this for vanity, which could not be more wrong. I think every woman has her reason for going down this path. If you were looking for an easy route, you would choose something different than surrogacy, because surrogacy is not easy. IVF is not easy. I would love to meet a mom by IVF and surrogacy who said, that was the simplest thing that I've ever done in my life, because I wouldn't be able to relate and they would stick out like a unicorn to me.
Right.
There are so many invisible reasons a person can approach surrogacy, and they're all valid. And I say it truly, I've not met somebody who just felt like going down this path.
We've talked a lot about surrogacy. We've gained so many insights on this episode. And I think that any patient that I have in the future who's considering surrogacy, thinking about surrogacy, who's even remotely mentioned it, I think it's one thing for us as physicians to talk about the medical stuff, if you will, like the logistical of the medicine and how the egg and the sperm are going to get into the uterus and what that's going to look like. But understanding the emotional experience is something that has to come from people who've gone through it. And so this is an absolutely invaluable resource. So if there's somebody listening, and I'm sure that there is, who is beginning to consider surrogacy, or their physician has maybe mentioned surrogacy at some point, what advice, encouragement, what would you want them to know? Like, what do you wish that you knew or understood maybe sooner in your journey?
So one of the biggest pieces of advice I will give anyone who's starting out is to lean into the community, which can be overwhelming at first, but there are Facebook groups that are free resources. There's free support calls through organizations like Oasis. There's plenty of resources out there that are free and low cost just to get yourself acquainted with who's in this community. One of the first conversations that any intended parent should have, other than with their doctor, is with a lawyer. And like any other resource you're looking for, you can take more than one call. Call more than one lawyer and get a feel for who you think you'd like to work with. Get an explanation about what are the laws that govern surrogacy. And then break into these groups, talk to other intended parents. We are almost all willing to have a conversation with someone and just give a play-by-play on what our journeys have looked like. I think the best advice that I've received had been coming from other intended parents who've taught me, essentially, here are the mistakes that I made, don't make them, or here's what worked for me. And these are things that you can do and you can put into practice for your own journey to have a smoother experience. And that's so important. It didn't really exist in the way that it exists today when we were getting started. It's one of the reasons that we became community builders in this space. I run, for example, a Facebook group for Canadian intended moms, and it's private. So the only people who can see who's in the group are other people in the group, which is excellent, because if you aren't yet ready for your friends and family to know that you're thinking about surrogacy, you can get into a group with 400 other Canadian women who are either in the research phases of their journey, actively on a journey, or who have gotten to the point of motherhood through surrogacy. And you have all of these women to cheerlead for you, to answer your questions, to be there when you're having a rough day. It is a hoppin' Facebook group, I will tell you. It's very active. And all you have to do is reach out and I can add you into it. So it's a good space to be in. You need to talk to other people or you will make the same mistakes that everybody else has made before you, and you don't need to.
To Baden's point, I don't doubt the level of community that is around you. You might feel like you're the only one or feel certainly like it's unusual, but there is a wonderful, wonderful community, and not necessarily that we've built, but that has been built that we're now a part of. Baden and I are natural community builders and like to do a lot of that work to build community. We've hosted intended parent couples for a wine and cheese at our dinner table. We just like to find friends, and I think that our daughter Scotty will know just as many friends who are born via gestational surrogacy as any other way, because those are the people that we like to surround ourselves with at the moment. So yeah, don't feel like you're alone, and just know that for whatever hard times that you're going through at the moment, that the baby at the end is absolutely worth it. It makes all of it magically disappear. So it's great.
Thank you so much, Baden and Zane, for being here. It was really a pleasure to have you both. And we're looking forward to hearing about your second surrogacy journey. And thank you, Baden, with your business, helping people that are looking for surrogacy have a match.
Thank you guys so much for coming on. As I said, we talk about the medical stuff. We talk about how to find a surrogate, the legalities to some degree, but hearing people talking about the experience and the ins and outs, the emotional stuff, I would argue is just as important, or maybe even more important, to be honest, to sort of hear those stories and to know things from the other perspective as well.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast, or visit us online at markandfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss.
Music by Mixkit. Life is a Dream by Michael Ramirez C.
My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.